Hey guys, welcome back. You will eat Doritos and cereal for dinner and you'll like it too.
So we're advertising about cereal for dinner. If you think about the cost of cereal for a family.
Or at least that's what the head of PepsiCo wants you to think. He said at a recent big food conference that he wanted to make more PepsiCo products, not just snacks and side dishes, but also the main ingredients in major meals like dinner. Company after company lined up to say the exact same thing. They wanted to expand the number of occasions in which junk food is an acceptable option. They're also pushing back hard against characterizations of ultra-processed food as being a bad thing. So what's going on with the big food industry? Today, I want to take you through some of the key trends and challenges it's facing, as well as analyzing the stock of PepsiCo, a dividend investor darling, and giving you my thoughts on whether I think it is a buy. Companies with strong brand names like PepsiCo have really flexed their pricing power over the last few years. By that I mean they've been increasing their prices again and again.
Carrefour told French customers it will no longer sell PepsiCo products including Pepsi, Lay's crisps and 7-Up. We are no longer selling this brand due to unacceptable price increases.
And yet consumers still keep flocking back to the product. But that's finally started to catch up with them. Pepsi said in their recent earnings call that the total sales volume had actually started to decrease in North America, at least, despite total revenues going up because of price increases. That's because lower income consumers in America can't necessarily afford to keep up with the price increases. That means that food companies are getting desperate to increase sales volume, and to do that they are planning on changing the culture surrounding junk food and making it more acceptable to eat it at mealtimes. For example, PepsiCo is encouraging Doritos recipes for things like Dorito casseroles, Dorito burgers, and so on. Meanwhile, the Kellogg's CEO is encouraging cash-strapped consumers to eat cereal for dinner as it's a cost-conscious choice.
The cereal category is a place that a lot of folks might come to because the price of a bowl of cereal with milk and with fruit is less than $1. So you can imagine why a consumer under pressure might find that to be a good place to go.
Something tells me though that the CEO of PepsiCo probably isn't eating Doritos casseroles and that kind of food with his family every night. But there are signs that the campaign to make junk food more palatable in meals is actually being successful. PepsiCo has partnered with Papa John's and Taco Bell's to do Doritos themed tacos and sandwiches, and they seem to be very popular. Also on social media, there are signs of success in the form of various different trending topics like #GirlDinner, or a trend whereby women were encouraged to post videos of their dinner consisting of various snacks, and that did extremely well on platforms like TikTok.
Nothing makes you realize how bad your addiction to girl dinner is until you get in a relationship. And then the guy is like, what are we having for dinner? Like, what are we eating? Where are we going? What are we making? And you're like, cheese and crackers.
Big food companies are also pushing back hard against the idea of ultra-processed foods and the fact that they're bad for human health. Now, study after study has shown that ultra-processed foods, or foods that have been through numerous stages of processing, can be bad for human health and are linked to conditions like heart disease, cancers, and so on. But there is some level of nuance to it. For example, pure lard is not processed at all, but it is still very bad for you. Whereas there may be some foods that have been processed, like for example, pasteurization with milk, that are not bad for you. So the junk food companies have seized upon this as saying that ultra processed food is not even a real thing. The PepsiCo CEO said he did not like the term ultra processed and he didn't believe it was real. It's just a buzzword. But realistically, it's not exactly rocket science to draw a link between eating bowls of Cheetos and washing it down with Mountain Dew being quite bad for you in the long term. And governments worldwide have started doing investigations and research of their own into whether processed food can be bad for you, and then drawing and rewriting policy based off of that. That hasn't stopped junk food companies from starting to lobby the government and tell them to not make drastic changes to food policy based on the results that they have from these experiments. The president of the CBA, a food lobbying group that represents the interests of various big food companies throughout the world, wrote an impassioned defense of food processing, where he basically praised human ingenuity, innovation, and the ability to save time for consumers by them eating processed foods rather than preparing full meals instead. And he also went on to say that processing allows people to have more time to create more memories. Something tells me, though, that those memories probably aren't being created over eating a bowl of Oreos and Doritos in your kitchen. Now, we can't talk about junk food companies without mentioning the elephant in the room, the Ozempic effect. Now, if you haven't heard about Ozempic, it is a weight loss drug which effectively suppresses the appetite of people who take that drug. And it's extremely effective, having been prescribed to millions of Americans and people around the world. People have been worried that Ozempic may decrease the appetites of Americans' consumers and thus affect the profits of junk food companies. Now, junk food companies have benefited for decades from the secular trend of obesity, effectively. As waistlines have expanded, people have spent more and more money on junk food, and companies like Pepsico have benefited greatly. Were this trend to go into reverse with Americans becoming slimmer, it would be pretty bad for the bottom line of junk food companies. But will customers who have slimmed down really cut back on their junk food spend? There have been some studies coming out of Walmart that have actually proved that people who are taking Ozempic do have a different type of spend or shopping basket to those who haven't. Because Walmart has in-store pharmacies, they're able to monitor which customers have bought Ozempic or other weight loss drugs from their pharmacies, anonymize that data, and then monitor what kind of products those customers are buying on the rest of their shops in terms of food and other products. And from those studies, they have shown that customers who are on Ozempic are less likely to buy as many items as those who aren't, and also tend to buy items with less calories in them. So it's not looking good for junk food companies on that basis. However, it is still very early days, and the Walmart CEO cautioned to not really take much judgment from that because it's still too early to say. The impact of weight loss drugs like Ozempic will take a huge amount of time to be felt in the bottom line of companies like Pepsico, because just not that many people take it at the moment. By the end of the decade, around 7% of Americans are forecast to be on Ozempic or other weight loss drugs, and so that might have more of an effect then, but even then it's not that much. So companies like PepsiCo, their CEOs have been relatively sanguine on the issue because it's not really a pressing matter and they have plenty of time to prepare for it. Finally, I want to talk about PepsiCo as a company and an investment. There's so many people who are interested in this business because of its status as a dividend king. That means that the company has increased its dividend every year for 50 years plus. That's absolutely insane, and it's very rewarding for any shareholder who is collecting those dividends. Or is it? When you compare PepsiCo's performance to the S&P 500, it has underperformed massively for the last 5 or even 10 years. That's with dividends included as well. So it doesn't really make sense for someone to invest in a company that pays a big dividend if its price is underperforming the S&P 500. But why is it underperforming? Well, if we look at PepsiCo's revenue, we can see that it's been growing its revenue at around 7% per year for the last 5 years, or only 3% per year for the last 10 years. It's going to be extremely difficult to beat the S&P 500, which has historically grown at around 10% per year with that level of revenue growth. Ultimately, EPS and free cash flow is driven by revenue growth without increasing your margins massively, which isn't really possible in a business that is as competitive as Pepsi's. You're not really going to be able to see much profit growth beyond what revenue growth is driving. When I do a very basic comparison of PepsiCo and Meta, my largest personal stock holding, they actually have very similar valuations based on price to earnings ratio, where they're both around 20 to 25, and free cash flow yield, where they're both around 3%. But Meta is just growing at so much faster a rate, and even though PepsiCo has some level of defensive premium because in a bad economy, their products will still sell and their revenues won't drop that much. It's not like the stock price is completely insulated from the economy. Just look at the COVID crash where PepsiCo dropped just as much as any other stock in that time period. I actually think that the dividend king status of PepsiCo is a huge hindrance to the company, not a benefit. Why? Well, they pay nearly 80% of their net income as dividends to shareholders, which means they have very little left over to pay off debt. And they can't actually even cut the dividend, because were they to do that, the stock price would fall massively, given them losing the status as a dividend king. And how much debt do they have? Well, it's not a ridiculous amount, but it is a significant amount, being around 4 to 5 years multiple of their free cash flow, which means that if they had to cut the dividend almost entirely and do no buybacks, it would still take them 4 to 5 years to pay off the debt. When you compare that to a company like Meta, which has absolutely massive amounts of cash and very little debt in comparison, I know exactly which company I'd rather be buying shares in. So this was more a video on the challenges that big food companies are facing and how they're sneakily dodging and getting around them. But I'd also be very curious to hear what your thoughts are about PepsiCo as a business. I know it's really popular in the YouTube investor community. I've previously looked into investing into the company, but didn't for the reasons I've already mentioned. But I'd be curious if you guys have investments in them or are curious about them as well. Additionally, there's been some recent information that Berkshire Hathaway has just sold around 13% of its stake in Apple in Q1 of this year. I previously made a video speculating on this and whether they would actually sell. So if you want to see that, please click the video here. And if not, I'll see you guys next time.